lots of people know and talk about. But really, basically, it's following the principles that God established when He created the plants to grow together in conjunction with the biology. And so we're really just trying to restore the natural order, if you will. If you will, we're trying to bring some of those what you would find the concepts that are happening in native pastures or native woodlands. We're trying to bring those back into a cropping situation and trying to do it in little small segments in between crops. That's what cover crops basically are. And then, of course, a lot of the same things that we're using for our farmers and ranchers are the exact same things that were being used in food plots. Because again, the principles don't change just because the animals do. And so we may need to use different plants to be highly attractive and beneficial to deer than what I would with cattle or with sheep or with goats, that you can tweak each of those just a little bit. But the principles remain the same in that we want to keep the ground covered and we want to have a living root out there all the time, and we want to maximize their diversity, and we really want to minimize the amount of disturbance in the system, whether that be physical disturbance through tillage, or what a lot of people don't understand is that we also want to minimize, not eliminate, but minimize the amount of chemical disturbance through herbicides, and even commercial synthetic fertilizers can disturb the biological communities that we've created. So that's kind of our background and our journey. We started with just my brother and I and a couple of the kids helping us out, and now we've got 55 employees and a couple different locations, and are shipping seed to all 50 states and most of Canada. And so it's really been a fun journey. We've got to meet a lot of cool people along the way. And one of the things that we've always really stressed is education. The vast majority of our marketing budget goes directly to education, because we've always felt like if people understand what's going on in the soil, how that soil functions, the only logical conclusion they can come to is they have to have a plant growing as much as possible. And if it's not going to be a cash crop that they're going to harvest, then it needs to be a cover crop. And that's where cover crops kind of fill that niche.
So I want Dallas, so you can kind of understand how we came upon you. And I think that there's a lot of correlation to how you got into what you're doing and kind of how we have gotten into it. So I want to give Dallas a chance, because this is really a discussion I kind of want him to lead, because he's the one that grew up on the farm. He's the one that has the background. I know who's so passionate about what he's learning from you. So I kind of want you to kind of now explain to Keith the same sort of idea that he just explained to us.
Sure. So a little background on us is that we live in Western New York, and it's an ag area. So it used to be dominated all by dairy. Now it's probably half and half between dairy and cash crop. But it's, a lot of it's your basic corn, bean, wheat rotation, probably more corn, beans than anything, and a lot of hay baling. Mm-hmm. And then on the dairy side, you're seeing a lot of the silage, corn and hay silage chopping, and then a little leftover cash crop. And then my background personally is I grew up on a dairy farm here in Western New York, and at one time we milked about 250 cows. But the dairy business is gone, and they went to just a cash crop rotation with hay bale and corn and soybeans and a little bit of wheat. But my father and Billy's father-in-law who owned the farm, they just recently retired and sold off some of the farmable land. Fortunately, that's stayed in the family, so we kind of still have the farm existing as it was. But the rest of it's kind of become a deer farm, which, that's our other side of our background, is that I grew up, my family, my brother and my dad and me, we grew up pretty passionate whitetail hunters. And, as we get older, that's the lane that we've stayed in, to the point where Billy's got a podcast that we pretty much just talk about whitetail hunting all year round. So, but from the farming side, okay, so I guess I would start by saying how I came across you and Green Cover Seed, which is directly through Growing Deer TV, Dr. Grant Woods. I know that you guys have a relationship with him, and that now you're his seed supplier, and he helps design the food plot mixes for you. So that's a door that you guys opened up probably within only the last year or two, where you are directly in the food plot and white-tailed deer industry now, even if it's just through what Grant is doing. But I'll tell you, he's opened up a wide new customer base for you, and not just customers, because I'm sure that what you're selling for seed on the food plot side is probably nowhere, it's probably a minute percentage of your business that you're doing, but it's opening a lot of eyes to this whole regenerative ag is really where I go.
Yeah.
I've kind of, since following, Grant and starting to follow some of your stuff, I've actually gone down a rabbit hole of this regenerative ag. And I've become actually.
Be careful, a lot of people never come up from that hole.
So it's funny because it happens. I'm not the only one that I find the whole thing so fascinating, and especially with my background, the way that I grew up on a farm and the way we did things. And, we started out in more conventional when I was a kid, but, then we moved more towards no-till, but the cover crops were a very limited thing. And I guess that's what I really notice around here with the farms, is that there's limited cover crops, and I feel like and there's challenges with where we live with the short growing season, high rainfall, high snow amount. So we have challenges that people deal with, but the cover crop side of things here is, generally people are planting winter wheat, and if they're doing it at all, they're planting winter wheat, and then they're killing it as soon as the ground dries up a little bit, so that they can either till or no till into that wheat stubble.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's kind of missing in this area. But, to back up a little bit, like I say, that's the way that we came across you, and with what you're doing on the food plot side I think it's really has opened a lot of eyes.
Yeah, it's been a great couple of years with our relationship with Grant, and we kind of, our paths kind of have crossed, peripherally in the past, mostly because we're both kind of preaching the same message with regenerative ag, and then a couple of years ago he came to us, and we really got down to business. We know plants really, really well. He knows what plants the deer will eat really, really well. And so by bringing those two things together, bringing our experience from the ag side, his experience from the deer side, we've really been able to do some pretty cool stuff. And I think one of the reasons that it works so well is, our company mission statement is regenerating God's, helping people regenerate God's creation for future generations. And, his is, enjoy creation and know the creator. And so there's just a lot of synergy from, mindsets and missions. But I told Grant, I said, watching some of your videos, and particularly when he's talking about the soil, I said, you could give that talk at any of the soil health conferences that I go to with all farmers, and it would be a great talk, because again, it's the same principles. Doesn't matter if you're in, Western New York, or, the Branson, Missouri area, or central Nebraska. Those principles are going to work wherever you're at. Now, the practices that you need to use to get yourself there, they're going to be a little different. The best food plot mixes for your area, they're going to be a little different than what we would use here for a livestock operation, or that, maybe what Grant would use. And a lot of it has to do with the timing, not necessarily the species, but the timing. And so, we've been able to bring a lot of that knowledge and experience from working with customers all across North America, and kind of mesh and mold that with what Grant's doing. But the messages are very consistent in that, it's the soil health principles: keep the soil covered, keep a living root in the ground as often as possible, be as diverse as possible, and to minimize that disturbance that we talked about. And then the fifth principle is, to integrate livestock, which of course with the deer guys, their livestock is coming to them. And then there's kind of a sixth principle that gets talked about a lot, and that's just know the context of what you're doing. And that's why you have to understand what is going to work best in your area. and for your special circumstances. So when those principles are followed, lots of success can happen.
So you've already listed the principles twice here, so I don't want to make you repeat it too much. But one of the first things I wanted to do was I really just want to take this conversation more in the soil health direction and away from the food plots and the deer hunting for a little while, because we beat that stuff to death a little bit. We just had a podcast on Tuesday night about food plots, and it feels like about the 9th one we've done this year. So I really just, obviously it all ties together, and we'll talk deer a little bit, but really I'd like to have you go and spend a little bit more time on these soil health principles one at a time, and just, and more than just listing them, give us a minute or two on why each one is so important and what it means and how they all work together.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just, we do put out a soil health resource guide every year. They're completely free. If you can get them on our website, you can download PDFs, or you can request, we'll send out a printed copy of the newest ones. This is our 8th edition, and you just go to greencover.com and go to our resources page to get that. But what I wanted to show on here, I don't know how well this will show up on the camera, but in each of these issues, we have full articles about each of these soil health principles. So this one is on know your context, and then keep the soil covered, minimize disturbance. And what we like to do is with each issue, we want to cover the same topic, but it's a different person that's writing that article. And so sometimes it's from a farmer's perspective, sometimes it'll be from a scientist's perspective. So we'll certainly discuss them, but if people want to take a little bit deeper dive, they can download those all from our website completely for free. So anyway, initially everybody just talked about the 5 main soil principles, but I do want to start out with the context one because it is so important, and it's one that Gabe Brown and Ray Archuleta, they founded an organization called Understanding Ag, and they're consultants within this space, and they've really preached this one. So they've really brought this to prominence. But I really like it because the context is just simply knowing what's your climate, what's your growing conditions, what is your goal for trying to plant these, whether it's a food plot, in your guys' world, or whether it's a cattle or a sheep guy in my world, or it might just be a row crop farmer. The context is, what do you want to try to accomplish? What are your goals? And then what are the environmental constraints that you're working within, your rainfall, your when, how are you going to terminate it and when? So, we're not going to solve that problem here. Certainly it's something that each person has to kind of figure out on their own, but we really want to stress that because too many people think there's these magic beans that they can plant and it will solve all their problems. And unfortunately, it's just not that easy. Certainly having plants growing out there are going to solve a lot of your problems, but to get the right plants planted at the right depth and at the right time and in the right situation, that takes a lot of management. Cover crops will increase the level of management that you're going to have to do, whether it's on a 10,000 acre farm or an 1/8 of an acre. It is going to require additional management over just, tilling and spraying and burning. Those are all fairly simple and straightforward. Everybody knows how to do those. Now, they're pretty destructive, but they're fairly straightforward and simple. So this requires a little bit more management. Now, the good thing is with people like Grant out there, just really showing step by step how to do it. In fact, he's going through a series right now where he's starting, from the ground and just, here's how you clear a food plot, or at least here's how we do it. There's many ways to do it. And so he is showing the context of how he's doing it, which I think is going to be very valuable for people who are just beginning. And he's doing all of this new little project that he's doing. He's doing it all with hand tools because he recognizes that a lot of people aren't going to have tractors and drills and roller crimpers. So he's really trying to step people through, here's how you can do this with a limited amount of investment, but probably a maximum amount of labor to do it, because it is hard work, as you guys well know. So that's kind of that first one that we talk about, is just the context. And every situation is going to be just a bit different, and you will be doing yourself a disservice if you don't put a little bit of time into doing some research about exactly what you need And you know, YouTube is, you know, there's a lot of yuck on YouTube, but there's a lot of great stuff. I mean, it's a treasure trove. I think anything that I need to fix in my house or on my car anymore, I can find somebody on YouTube has made a video of how to do that. And I'm very grateful for that because, you know, you used to, you know, just really have to make a lot of mistakes and struggle on your own to figure that out. So anyway, that's kind of that first principle is know the context of what you're dealing with so that you can make intelligent decisions or at least get connected with people who can help you make those decisions about what's going to work best, whether it be seed or where to put your food plot or, you know, how to do this. Everything is context derived. And then as we move into the to more of the agronomic soil health principles, you know, and I've seen people list these in different ways. And I heard somebody just the other day that they think the most important one is, you know, keep a plant growing at all times that you can. And, you know, you can make an argument for any of those. But the one I always start first with and list first is keep the soil covered. Because I've seen way too many situations, even in no-till. Okay, so people think no-till is the answer, but we've got neighbors. You probably have people, you know, there's people all over that are doing this. They're not tilling the ground, but because they're raking up and baling up and removing all the residue, basically that ground is bare. Yeah. And then it blows, it washes away. You lose so many benefits when you remove the residue. And tillage is certainly going to do that. There's no doubt about that. But we can have bare ground even without tillage is the point that I want to make. And so it's so important that we keep the soil covered. Number one, it keeps the sunlight, the direct sunlight off the soil. Sunlight is great for plants. Plants need it to do photosynthesis. Sunlight is bad for the soil as far as directly hitting it because it heats it up, it dries it out, it bakes it, it cooks it, it makes it so hot that it's going to start killing off your biology. So sunlight is a great thing for your system, but only if it's hitting a green leaf. If sunlight's not hitting a green leaf, number one, you're wasting it, and number two, it's actually probably harming your overall system. So sometimes it's a real struggle to keep the soil covered, particularly if you're in drier areas or if you're in a large part of the country right now that's experiencing pretty severe drought. It's hard, and you're not always going to accomplish it, but it should always be your goal. Mm-hmm. And to be able to do that, you're going to have to figure out either how to eliminate tillage or at least get something growing right away again if you do have to do a little bit of tillage. But it's always to just keep that soil covered. So, you know, I'm curious in you guys' experience, you know, how have you seen, you know, keeping the soil covered? How have you seen that kind of lived out in your own situations there in New York?
Food plot wise, I'm doing that now, but I'm probably one of the few farmers, if you want to call me a farmer in the area.
You're a farmer, Dale.
That's actually doing it because we've got the same thing going on as you mentioned. There's so many good points there, but keeping the soil covered is something that people here struggle with. And part of it's tillage, and part of it is just the fact that a lot of guys here are feeding cows, so they're taking every bit of crop off of their fields that they can, and certainly that's something that's easy to understand why they're doing that, but it's hard to, you know, I can understand where especially dairy or, you know, cattle guys have problems with keeping the soil covered because everything they're growing, they're trying to feed to their cattle. And hardly anyone here is doing any grazing other than just a typical pasture situation where they're just letting them eat the grass right down to nothing and then moving them to the next paddock. You know, nobody's really doing, I shouldn't say nobody. I'm sure there's people doing it, but in a wide range, you're not seeing a lot of guys that are managing cattle in a way that they're not just taking from the pastures. They're just letting them eat it till there's no food left, and then they're moving it to another one, or they're bringing food into the pasture.
Yeah, and what's interesting for me is so Dallas preemptively for this conversation have you watch a couple of your lectures. And so yesterday I'm driving around. I travel for work, so I'm on the road all day. It's all ag land, so I'm driving around, and now I'm like super aware of all these fields that, like right now, middle of summer, that have nothing in them. Yeah. So I don't know what's going on with those fields, but you start like paying attention. It's no different than when you start becoming aware of issues of, whether it's the emerald ash borer or something we've had big problems with gypsy moths out here the last couple of years. So once you become aware of these things, then all of a sudden you start paying attention to it. So I'm driving around looking at these fields and I'm like, oh my gosh, look at all these fields that are completely barren, like bare dirt right now, middle of summer.
So a lot of what that is wheat. Our wheat crop just came off in the last 3 weeks or so. And a lot of guys just leave their wheat fields fallow all the way until next year, which is just, that's one of the biggest opportunities that I see wasted around here is fallow wheat fields. Now, some guys, like our farm's got like a 50-acre wheat field on it that they haven't done anything yet except for inject manure into it. And I'm assuming they're going to put a seeding into it, a fall seeding. So they'll at least be doing something with it. But even still, there's a month already there where there's no plants growing in that soil. And I like the term harvesting sunlight. I think I might have got that from Grant, where exactly, that you said that sunlight is good for plants and bad for soil, and it's obvious. But if you think of it as having a green, so now you're touching on all these principles, having a growing plant, a living root, covering the soil. But if you think of it as, what your green plant is doing is it's harvesting that sunlight. So the sunlight is the best tool in the world as long as it's being used by a living growing plant and it's staying off the soil. And in the middle of the summer, when do you get the most sunlight, especially in Western New York? We don't get a lot of sunlight sometimes, but when you do get a lot of sunlight is June, July, August, September, right? So those are the key times when you really want plants to be growing and harvesting that sunlight. And like Billy said, right now, it's amazing how many places are not doing that.
Yeah, particularly with the amount of rainfall you guys get. You're not only wasting sunlight, but you're wasting rainfall. And the soil can only hold so much moisture, and when it's full, then there's only two things that are going to happen to that moisture. It's either going to keep going down through the soil and just percolating deeper, which is taking nutrients with it, or it's going to run off the top and cause erosion and nutrient loading of your waterways. And so both of those are bad. So you've got, you need to use some of that moisture in that time frame because your soils just physically cannot hold all the moisture that you would get. So you just as well run it through a plant and do good things for the soil. And then the more carbon you put into the soil through plants growing, the more moisture you can hold. And so you can actually dramatically increase how much water you can store. Every additional percent of organic matter is going to give you approximately 25,000 gallons of additional water storage on an acre. And so, if you can, like what Grant has done, when he started there, on that Ozark mountainside, he probably had, 1 to 1.5% organic matter. Well, now a lot of his fields are, 5 and 6%, so he's essentially storing 100,000 gallons of water per acre, more than he could have when he started, and more than a lot of his neighbors that have not done any development. It's pretty incredible to go to his fields, do a soil probe, and it's great soil, but you can hardly probe it because there's rocks all over the place because it's literally a bunch of rocks with this great soil right on top. And he's built it, basically, not from the bottom up, but from the top down. And it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the misconceptions. We just had this talked about on a show we did a couple weeks ago. The 5 of us were sitting on the deck talking, and we were talking about tilling. And the point came up of, well, we need more of a water infiltration. I think it was Brian or Brad that said it. And Dallas quickly corrected him and said, well, no, when you turn that ground up, you're opening it up, and that water isn't going to infiltrate the same way it would as if you left the ground intact and didn't, let the organic matter be on top and help that soil be healthier. And that's a misconception I had until I started learning some of these things working with Dallas, that's really a big reason why we're trying not to till the ground is to help it so that we can absorb some of that water.
Yeah, the two places where a lot of tillage is done, number one is in farming, because farmers think that's going to help get water into the soil. The other one is in construction and road building, and they're doing significant tillage because they're trying to keep anything from entering that soil. So one of those two people are wrong, and I don't think probably you guys doing foundations and roads.
Interesting. Yeah.
Um, but it's funny because the farmers here are doing it for both reasons. So that's where it's funny because in the spring they're all out there in April, way before they're going to put corn in the ground, and they're all out there disking up their fields, and they're doing that to let the water out. I'm assuming because you can see the fields dry out as soon as they do that. So I can understand why that's one point where we do get a lot of moisture here. So it's tough for guys to get their fields dried out in the spring, and it does seem to accelerate that drying time because when it's 45 degrees out here but sunny in a mid-April day, and you can get on the field and work it up a little bit and let that moisture out, it does dry their fields up nicely. But then it'll sit there fallow for another 3 weeks too. So I guess I don't follow that. But you can see that they're doing it because of trying to get their soil dried out. So they know that that's going to happen, but yet they may or may not understand that it's going to adversely affect them right after they get their crop in the ground.
Sure. Yeah, you're letting water out. You're also letting a lot of the carbon out. You're basically oxidizing the carbon, and it's disappearing as CO2. But think about it. If you get if you're out back wherever and it rains and you need to get home, are you going to drive your pickup or your four-wheeler? Are you going to drive it through that tilled field? Or are you going to drive through the pasture right next to it that has green, living, growing plants, and it kind of has that sod? Well, I mean, the answer there is obvious. You're going to drive on the sod because even though they're both wet and both are holding water, the sod, that living root system, will hold you up. And so we've got a growing number of farmers discovering that if they can have that cover crop growing there, that root structure not only is using up some of that moisture to offset the fact that it might be too wet, but it also gives a lot of holding capacity of holding your equipment up. Now, the one thing that is a problem in northern climates is that we'll keep that cooler as well, because that tilled soil, black, is going to absorb sunlight and it's going to tend to heat up. So it will keep that soil typically cooler. So there's trade-offs back and forth, and we could talk the whole time probably just about that, but it does kind of morph into the second soil health principle that I want to talk about, and that is minimizing soil disturbance. We've talked a lot about tillage, and it certainly is a destructive process. In nature, the only tillage that you see in a natural system is through some sort of a catastrophe, whether it be an earthquake or some sort of catastrophic event, as far as widespread severe tillage. Now, there is a tremendous amount of tillage going on in really good natural native soils through earthworms, and they're doing that tillage through their burrows, but they're actually building soil structure instead of degrading it, because they're doing very precise. It's almost like a precision tillage, and it's up and down, and they leave those burrows that are great for helping get water into the soil. But I think everybody understands tillage, and a lot of the destructive things. It's destroying those earthworm channels, and so it really, not only does it really slow down your water infiltration, but it also slows down oxygen being able to get down into your soil. You can have the deepest, darkest, blackest soil possible. You can have all kinds of moisture in there, but your roots need two things to grow. They need water, but they also need oxygen. And so roots will never grow deeper than the deepest level that oxygen can get to. And so if you have restrictive layers, or you have areas where you're just not getting that air exchange between the oxygen and the atmosphere in your soil, you're going to be limited on how deep your roots can grow. And so that's another destructive thing that tillage does, is it limits that oxygen layer, because you're taking all the pore space out of your soil. That's what tillage does, is it collapses the pore spaces. And that's why it can't hold as much water, but it also can't hold as much oxygen. And so both are going to really limit how deep those roots can go. So those are a couple things. And then probably a third destructive thing that tillage does is it really disrupts the biology, particularly the fungal pathways, the fungal networks. So bacteria, there's two primary things in the biological world that we look at in soil. There's more than that, but the ones that get talked about the most are bacteria, which are dominant. They can reproduce themselves very quickly. They're teeny, teeny, tiny. And so tillage does not necessarily disrupt bacteria a lot because they're so small, and they can reproduce themselves very, very, very quickly. But the fungus, the fungal parts, particularly mycorrhiza fungi, they are not able to reproduce nearly as quickly, and they're not small. You know, they say that the largest living organism in the world is not the blue whale. It's not an elephant. It's a fungus growing up in a forest in the Pacific Northwest. And this one, and they've somehow done experiments to know that it's all one organism, but it covers thousands of acres. That's how big it is. Because these fungal communities can grow from one plant to the next plant to the next plant, and it basically just builds this like a giant spider web under the soil. And then when you do tillage, just think about what you would do to a spider web. If you're going to disc through it, you're chopping that up into a whole bunch of little pieces, really, really disrupting what it's trying to do. And so that tillage can be destructive that way. But I don't want to let the no-till guys off the hook, you know, by thinking that no-till is the only answer. It is part of the answer. But when you just substitute tillage for a whole bunch of chemicals and a whole bunch of synthetic fertilizers, you're substituting one disturbance for another. And so, you know, the excessive use of herbicides, excessive use of fungicides, insecticides, and all these pesticides, they're all going to be biological disturbances within your soil, which can be just as destructive as the physical disturbance of tillage. So, I mean, ideally, you know, the holy grail of soil health is to be both no-till and no chemicals. And that's really, really hard to do. That's why there's not very many people doing it. There's actually some guys really making a go of it. We call it organic no-till, to where they don't do any tillage and they don't use any chemicals. They don't use any synthetic fertilizers. In some years, it works pretty good for them. In other years, they have some failures. It's really, really difficult. It's really hard to do. But it's largely the system that Grant is promoting through the release process of, you know, no tillage and very little chemicals. Now, he will still use some chemicals if he needs to. And you can use tillage. All of these things are tools. They're tools to be used, but you have to use them appropriately. I mean, if you're trying to, you know, build a house and the only tool you had is a hammer, you know, then you'll get some jobs done, but you'll make a mess out of the rest of it. You know, if you're trying to cut a board and you're just using a hammer, you can get it done eventually, but it's going to be pretty jagged.
Yeah.
So I don't like it when people think that that's the only tool they have. It's a tool. Use it when you need to, but just know that there's going to be a cost associated with it, and then try to do things after using that tool that will help the soil recover.
There was an article that was brought to my attention recently, and I had seen the headline as well. I'll admit that I didn't open it up and read it, but I told the guy that pointed it out to me, I told him what I assumed that it said in there. Was the headline was something like, is no-till really better than tillage, or something like that. And I'm assuming that the study was based on farmers that were no-tilling, but they weren't using cover crops or any of the other soil health principles. So people have been led to believe that just no-till alone is going to help their system, but it's really not, because it lacks so many of the other things that are necessary for that to be a healthy ecosystem, that in the end you're probably not much further ahead. I would argue that you're probably still a little bit further ahead, but not much.
Yeah, and I think the key word that you said there is system. You know, we need to be thinking of it as a system, and not just, I've got this crop growing here this year. Well, how does that crop affect what I'm going to do next year and 2 years down the road? And how does what I did 2 years ago going to affect this crop? And so, unfortunately, a lot of us as farmers, and I'm one, and we're guilty of this sometimes too, you know, we're pretty short-sighted. We can only see what's in front of us, and we don't consider the bigger effects of how it will affect the future and what is the history there. Again, part of that goes back to the context of what have I done and what do I want to do. But a lot of it just simply has to do with the fact that we have been trained, whether through our schooling or through experience, or this is what Dad's always done kind of a thing. We've been trained to not necessarily think as a system, but more as components. I think they call it reductionist science. You know, when you reduce this huge complex thing down to the little variables, and I'm going to just change this one little thing and see what happens. Well, nature doesn't work that way. You can't isolate a variable in nature. You can do it in the lab. Very difficult to do in nature because you got so many other environmental factors that are influencing it. You can change or tweak one thing and get a different outcome, but you don't really know if it was that one thing that did that or if it was these other things that weren't the same as what you observed last year. And so I think the key word there is system. We need to start thinking in systems. And so as we think about systems, one of the biggest things that our agricultural system is missing as compared to nature, how God created, nature to work together, it's biodiversity. And you're starting to hear that more and more. And so that's that third principle of soil health is we want to maximize the amount of biodiversity that we can bring into our system. And again, in a farming situation, it's not very practical to grow 12 things out there at the same time and try to harvest them and have something that I can sell. Now, at some point, we do have people that are growing 2 things and 3 things together. They're harvesting the grain all together and then separating it out and selling it as individual products. I think we're going to continue to see that grow as we get, as color sorting technology gets better, as some of these things not only get better, but less expensive. We're going to see more and more people growing multiple crops together and separating them. Some huge benefits agronomically, weed control wise, but also in the quality of the product that they're producing. They're finding that when you grow these things in conjunction with each other, far less disease pressure, you have better nutrient density in the different grains. And so I think we'll see more and more of that. Now, for the cattle guys and for the food plotters, we're not trying to harvest grain, which is great because then it allows us to grow all these plants together and have this biodiversity. And what really, really bothers me is when people want to plant a cover crop and they're doing it in the summer. Dallas, like what you said, after wheat, perfect time to do it. And then they only want to plant sorghum sudan, or they only want to plant millet, or they only want to plant soybeans. It's like there's 20 different things that you could use. Let's pick at least 8 or 10 of them because we're going to get benefits from having that biological diversity. Because when we can get the biological diversity above the ground with all these different plants, and really what we're looking for is not necessarily the number of plants, but it's the number of different plant families that we have represented, because each of those plant families is going to do significantly different things in the soil. The root exudates that they're putting into the soil, the biological communities that they host and recruit and promote are going to be distinctly different. And so when we have multiple families, we can have huge benefits to the biology of the soil. So all the legumes are one plant family. All the grasses are one plant family. And all the brassicas, radishes, turnips, mustard, collards, rapeseed, kale, all those, that's one plant family. So all of those things are only 3 plant families. But when we get into the broadleaves, now we get a lot of different plant families. So sunflowers is different than flax, and phacelia is different than both of those, and sugar beets is a whole nother plant family. So we can really start to introduce a lot of diversity when we start putting in some of those broadleaf plants to complement the grasses and the legumes and the brassicas, which are widely used. That's still going to be the majority of our growth and biomass. But we bring a lot of diversity in when we have those. And so when we have those above ground diversity, we've got a diversity of root systems under the soil surface. And very importantly, we'll have a diversity of the root exudates that are being pumped out into the soil by these different plants. And like I say, that's just going to promote, recruit, and support a very wide biologically diverse community. And then the other thing that you'll see, and you guys have seen this when you've done these diverse mixes, you'll see incredible diversity of insect and bird life above the ground as well. And I love walking out into some of these diverse fields and just standing still and listening. And you can hear the bees, and you can hear the wasps, you can just hear the buzzing, you can hear the birds chirping. If you walk out into an agricultural field and you are quiet and you hear nothing, that's a bad sign. That's a sign of death and not life. And so we want to promote as much of that diversity as possible, whether it's, the plants, the insects, the roots, the biology, or the root exudates. That the diversity is just going to be really good for the soil. So again, curious to see how you guys have kind of seen that played out in your area.
Nobody's relay cropping or intercropping or anything as far as I know that I've seen, but I can tell you from experience in our food plots, I mean, a lot of the things that you're saying there, I always harp on diversity, but I'm on this podcast, but I think some people think that diversity is 4 different kinds of clover and chicory or whatever, or, different brands of corn or whatever, but what I took from Grant was the 4 different plant families, and then trying to have multiple different species from each different plant family all growing together. And that's what my food plots all are. And what you said about the insects is totally true. I mean, you walk out, it's getting a little bit less now as some of the plants are starting to mature and we're just starting to put some of the fall crops in. But
right.
A month ago, you walked out in our food plots and the buckwheat and the sunflowers and the cowpeas and soybeans and everything working together. I mean, as you said it, I mean, you stand there and be quiet and you just hear buzzing going on around you. I mean, the bees, the millions of bees that are in a 1/4 acre food plot, the grasshoppers. One thing that we've really noticed is that the turkeys really like our food plots this year better. We have a somewhat limited turkey population around here, and they used to be really good, but as everywhere in the country, turkeys are struggling with habitat. But the turkeys are loving it because they've got this whole ecosystem of 12 to 36 inch tall plants that they're walking around in, and they can still see the ground and have, not be totally covered up. But I think they're just eating grasshoppers all day long.
It's just full of bugs, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the grasshoppers and the bees and all the other insects that are out there. And that's another misconception of insects. You go out in your garden, you got Japanese beetles and all this other crap eating your plants, right? But I don't think we hear enough about beneficial insects, the insects that you actually want in your fields.
Yeah, that's been one of the fun things for me to watch over the last summer was when we really got going, and you had the summer release blend, and especially we have a food plot we call the garden that it used to be old pasture, and last year we converted it from it was pasture, then grew up into goldenrod and different grasses, and we converted that over into a food plot. And really, more than anything right now, it's not that we want the deer feeding there, but we just want something productive and growing in that area to kind of build the soil health. But it's been amazing to watch how well that's grown, but then to see all the different things that are using it. And to his point, the turkeys is incredible. I swear, I mean, we've been running the Cuddy Link camera system for a few years now, and we've got almost 3 years we've been running it. And so we've got 10 cameras going at all times, 12 months out of the year. And it seems like the volume of deer that we're holding, I mean, we're getting pictures nonstop all day long, middle of the day, deer are just out doing their thing. And it just seems that there's more activity on the property than what we had seen in 2.5-3 years ago before we got going with doing this. So it just seems like the life on the farm is thriving with all of this stuff that we're doing.
Yeah, wildlife definitely knows how to vote for what they like because they're going to vote by showing up. And when you start doing these things, when you start getting back to it's the principles of how God created things to work together. He didn't create plants to grow in monocultures. They don't thrive there without lots of extra inputs. They thrive in these diverse communities, just like people do. We do so much better when we have diversity of people around us, whether it be, different backgrounds or different talents. There's just great power in diversity, because now I don't have to do everything myself. I've got lots of other people I can surround myself with that can do some of the jobs that I'm just not very good at, or frankly don't like to do, but other people may. And it's kind of the same thing in the plant world. Certain plants have different niches that they fill and that they do well. And when we can bring all those together, plants will cooperate really quite well. In fact, probably better than most people do, actually. Plants will cooperate and share the resources, and they almost always look better in mixes than they do when planted by themselves. So the fourth principle of soil health, or that fourth agronomic principle, is to keep living roots as growing as often as possible. And obviously, in order to have living roots, you have to have a green growing plant. And so, that principle is just simply keep something growing there. People have this fallacy that the best thing for the soil is just to let it rest. You probably heard that, and even in the Bible, they talk about the Jubilee year where you're supposed to let the soil rest. And people think that the best way to let the soil rest is to not let anything grow in it. And that's the worst thing possible.
Yeah.
The best way to let your soil rest and recover is to let lots of diversity grow and then not harvest anything and take it away. That's the part where you're not letting the land rest, is when you're exporting all the nutrients that it's cycled and that it's produced, and you're exporting all that biomass, all that carbon, whether it's in a truck or in a hay bale. That's when your land doesn't rest. But if your land is bare and there's nothing growing, I promise you it's not resting. It is miserable, and it's, soil was never created to be bare, uncovered, and with nothing growing in it. It cannot exist in its, without that, it's just dirt. There's kind of a saying out there that, soil without biology, it's just geology. It's just rocks and minerals, but you got to have the biology to actually turn it from dirt to soil. And so this principle, just keep those living roots as often as possible. And again, this is very difficult to do as well. It should be your goal. You're not always going to accomplish it, especially in the drier areas. You just have to accept that fact, but it should be your goal. And again, it says as often as possible. So when you're, 0 degrees, there's nothing growing. Okay. It's okay if you don't have actively growing plants when it's 0 degrees. However, if you plant a crop like cereal rye, it's an incredible plant. It will germinate in 34-degree soils. Nothing else does that. So you can plant it in December, and if it's 34 degrees or better in your soil, which it likely will be still in December, that plant is going to sprout. And if you can get a little growth on it, as long as it's above 38 degrees and the sun is shining, that plant is actually going to photosynthesize. And think about, even in these cold climates, think about how often you have days that are above 38 and the sun shines. Well, yeah, you can get some a little bit of growth. You'll get some photosynthesis. It's not going to be a lot. You're not going to be able to go out there and measure how fast it's growing. But the thing that you'll notice is that rye plant stays green all winter long, whereas wheat and most of these other cereals, when they go dormant, it's a hard brown dormant. And it can be 50 degrees in the sunshine. And if that plant is brown, there's no chlorophyll in those cells anymore, it's not going to be doing anything. So even when you're in those really off seasons and you think not much is happening, there's plants like cereal rye and hairy vetch and some of these really cold tolerant clovers that can overwinter, can survive those cold conditions. And then when the conditions are right, they'll take off and start growing. So again, in the food plot world, it's much, much easier than the agricultural world, because again, your goal is not to try to harvest grain. It's to try to produce feed and forage and attraction for deer, deer habitat. And so it's much easier to have the diversity, and it's much easier to take it from one crop to another. For most crops, and again, most people don't realize this, for most crops, it takes about 50% of the moisture that plant is going to need to get from the plant stage to where it starts reproduction, where it starts to put on a head or put on an ear, whatever it's going to do to try to make that seed. And then the other 50% of the moisture that it needs is basically to take it from that stage all the way out to dry grain. And a lot of times people don't have the moisture to do that, to take it all the way out to a grain crop. But oftentimes you have that first half of the moisture that you need to grow the plant, grow them vegetatively. And so we can get by in either where guys are largely livestock and grazing based, or the food plot based, where we're just trying to grow vegetation and not grain. Much, much easier to do than to try to take it out to grain harvest. So Again, with grant system, with what we are using with a lot of our livestock guys, we may be planting at a minimum twice a year, planting something that's going to grow in the warm part of the year and then planting something that will grow more in the cool season. As you get south, our customers down in, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, they need to really plant 3 times a year because otherwise they have such a long warm part of their growing season that one planting of a warm season thing, it's just going to go to seed. It's going to get to full maturity, and then it's going to die off, and nothing will be there. So they may have to plant 3 times a year to really do this right, to follow this principle of soil health, of keeping living roots out there as often as possible. And we've talked a lot about this, but you will not ever build your soil if you don't have plants growing out there. It's the only way that soil gets built. Yeah, you can, the weathering of rock will build you an inch of soil every 10,000 years or whatever. Most people aren't patient enough to wait 30 seconds for the microwave to heat up their burrito, let alone wait 10,000 years for an inch of topsoil. But with a really good diverse system, you can literally grow half an inch to an inch of soil a year by following these principles and keeping those plants living and growing out there as often as possible.
Yeah, that's the Grant Wood story there again. I mean, what you touched on it before, but what he's done out there is truly amazing. And that's, the proving grounds, as he calls it. He's proving that you can take one of the worst environments in the world and turn it into good soil and good deer hunting. Well, better than good, I mean, because like you were mentioning runoff before, like he not only is his property entirely made up of rocks, but it's also on a side of a mountain too. Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, to be able to infiltrate and hold water in that system and build organic matter at a pretty rapid rate and build topsoil on top of rocks, he's using all the principles that show you that this works, that this is the way to do it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, he's the Ward Lab's a big soil testing lab. They're actually right here in our backyard here in Nebraska, but they've been out to his place a couple times and pulled a bunch of soil samples, and yeah, they're just pretty amazed at how can this literally pile of rocks have this good a soil. Yes. It's a great testimony to the power of diversity, the power of a plant, and the power of tenacity, because Grant didn't get there overnight. He's been working at it for a while too, and he'll be the first to tell you that it's not going to be, an overnight success. Yeah, it's an overnight success that was 20 years in the making. I guess you might say. But
for sure.
When you follow the principles, and then the last principle is the integration of livestock, and of course, in the food plot world, that's the whole goal. Is we want to integrate deer, we want to integrate these animals to come in, and by, like I said before, they will vote by their presence, and if they like what you've got, they're going to show up and they're going to be there. But if they like what your neighbor has better, you're not going to see them. And so the whole goal is to provide an environment, a habitat, an ecosystem that is going to attract them and attract them at the right times. And a lot of people are having a lot of success doing that with these diverse mixes. In the farming area, it's a little more difficult to integrate that livestock, particularly if someone is mostly a crop farmer. They may have to find somebody that has cattle, or sometimes, you just don't have livestock integrated into the land. And what you see is you still can accomplish lots of things, but properly integrated livestock will accelerate the process, mostly because all of the biology, the microbes in a cow's rumen, when that gets excreted out onto the soil, it gives a huge boost to soil biology. And so you're missing that when you don't have that livestock integration. Now you can kind of tweak that a little bit by applying manure or some of these compost extracts. We can introduce some of that same biology through those methods. But again, God created this amazing biological fermentation vat called the rumen, in these ruminant animals, and it's pretty incredible what it does. And it's actually not the animal that's doing the digesting of all that grass and that high cellulose things. it's all of the biology. It's the microbes that are living in the rumen that's actually doing the work. And so it's pretty incredible when you look at the similarities between the rumen and what's going on in the soil, and even our gut biome. There's lots of good research coming out now about how important our gut biome is and how similar that is to what's going on in the soil.
Yeah, and so I've got a question that kind of goes along with this here. That so I don't know if you can see them on your end, Keith, but the listeners can actually chime in and ask questions and stuff. So Ben Williams, Benjamin, as he's listed here, but Ben Williams he's a good friend of ours. He's a land manager, has a habitat consulting company called Old Tin Cup, and he's got a question for you, and he's wondering about starting a food plot program into an old field that has no agriculture for 50 plus years at times. With that field might have now goldenrod and grasses. He wants to know your thoughts. Would you recommend or steer against initial soil disturbance or tillage before planting initially into that old field?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben. And, it's a question that farmers struggle with too, because if we want to come out of a perennial system and get back into an annual cropping situation, how do you best do that? Because that's essentially what you're talking about is you've got perennials out there and you want to convert to start growing more annuals. Really difficult to do. Now, remember, I said that tillage and herbicides are tools. And so you're probably going to have to use a tool. It's going to be up to you to decide which of those tools that you use. But I can tell you this, if you don't use a tool to help yourself through that situation, the chances of you getting annuals established into those firmly established perennials is pretty low. When it comes to allocation of resources, he who has the deepest roots is always going to win. And that's not going to be the annuals that you're trying to plant. That's going to be the perennials that are already there. So you might have to do a little bit of light tillage. You may have to use a little bit of, a burn down chemical. You don't have to completely kill the perennials, but man, you need to get them knocked in the head enough to really set them back to where those annuals have a really good chance of taking off and going. And you'll want to do the timing, if you can do the timing to when the perennials are in their least aggressive growth. And so you have to identify if you have warm season or cool season perennials. Try to hit it when they're at their most vulnerable to not wanting to grow, and then use annuals that are best suited to that. So if you have cool season perennials, you'd want to come in July when it's hotter than blazes, and those cool season perennials want to go dormant anyway, and then plant, cowpeas and sorghum and millet and buckwheat and sunflowers that like the heat and will grow very, very rapidly. Or if you have warm season perennials, you do the opposite. You wait till the fall when those warm season perennials are going dormant, and then plant cool season things like rye and vetch and clovers and alfalfa and things like that you can establish in that time frame. So you might be able to do that without any tools, tillage or herbicides, but a little bit applied at the right time or used at the right time. Again, it's a tool. Use it appropriately.
Now I got a question. I appreciate you answering that. I think that probably was great for Ben, your perspective on that. We've got we've got the farm and dairy ag land here where we're doing a lot of our stuff, but what a lot of our listeners, and including myself, our family property it's down in the Finger Lakes region, which is very hilly, mainly timber, not a lot of ag. And we've started, on our property over the last 25 years, we've worked on clearing some of these areas in the hardwoods and turning them into food plots. And one of the challenges we're having, we've got a probably quarter acre food plot right in the middle of the woods. We're having a very hard time getting actual plants established that we want to grow, not having the weeds take over. And so I was having a discussion back and forth with my dad and my brother last night, and they're trying to figure out, what their best approach is there. And I'm just curious, kind of similar, like what's your thoughts on that? Like we're at that point right now, we're kind of in that getting ready to plant some sort of a fall release and something that can be growing and in the soil throughout the winter. What would you recommend in a situation like that?
Well, again, it kind of depends on what the weeds are, but from my experience, the absolute best thing, not only at overwintering, but also doing spring and early summer weed suppression, cereal rye is hands down the king of that. So I would want to have a heavy shot of cereal rye because it's going to overwinter and it's going to be the first thing growing in the spring. A lot of weeds grow simply because there's no other competition. There's nothing else growing. And so, again, your soil wants something growing. It's going to encourage those weeds to grow. There's a lot of mechanisms in the soil where the soil can basically dictate what plants grow by, and it's not the soil so much as the microbes, the biology of the soil are dictating what's going to happen. And so if you've got things growing, then there's not nearly as many signals going out to recruit whatever seeds are out there, because the biology doesn't recognize one seed as a weed and another seed as a crop. It just sees seeds, and it will try to recruit things to grow because it's essentially their food source. The root exudates are. And so having something out there to compete, and nothing competes better than cereal rye, because like I say, it's going to be the first thing to grow in the spring. It's going to grow aggressively. It's got a very deep root system and a very big accumulation of biomass above the ground. Probably not as palatable to deer as what, oats or wheat or some of those things are going to be, but from a weed control standpoint, it's very, very difficult to beat. And that's one of the reasons that Grant and I, we rolled out a new food plot mix here just recently. He's called it Plot Release, and it's got about 3 to 4 times the amount of cereal rye in it that the fall release has, primarily because we were seeing this issue of the rye that was in there was overwintering and giving some spring weed control, but it wasn't at a high enough population. It wasn't thick enough to do what he was wanting to see it do. So that Plot Release has a much higher inclusion rate of cereal rye. And you can kind of do the same thing. You can take the fall release, or you take whatever other blend you have and just add another 20 or 30 pounds of rye to it. Just kind of boost it on the rye side of things, and that will give you the best spring weed control of anything that I know of.
Yeah, and we've seen with the rye, it's simply also, it might not be very palatable to the deer, but going back to the point of how we've seen wheat drop off, this is a big conversation Dallas and I have had, but we keeping so much, I think we had quite a bit of rye growing this spring on the farm, and we had a lot of good habitat for fawning and for turkeys for cover, where a lot of the other things haven't grown up yet. You don't have leaves on in the woods, so it was a huge benefit to us, I believe, to do that. So you getting close to needing to tap out here?
Well, I've got another meeting at 9:15 here,
okay.
So yeah, I've got another 5 minutes.
Well, we can start to close her out too. So I think we hit really what we wanted to. We wanted to get those principles out there, and I am fascinated by the work you're doing, and I'm learning a lot from Dallas, physically going out and doing it in the field here. And I think what you're doing can be a great resource. We talk a lot about this stuff on the podcast, but you're coming at it from almost from the scientific back end and giving some really good information on how this stuff works. And I'm going to put it in the information, the description of the podcast. I'll put a couple of the links from the videos that I watched before we jumped on here today. And it's quite eye-opening, and some of the comparisons you use to the economy and infrastructure of our country and how that is similar to the way that soil works and how the environment works it's fascinating, the connections that you draw between those two things. And I know we would love to get you back on sometime to kind of further the discussion, because you could go for hours on hours talking about some of this stuff. So
yeah, no, I'd be happy to do that. And one of the so you're referencing the Carbonomics talk, which has been a very popular, very useful talk, because it compares what's going on in the soil to the economy of the country. So it puts it in the context that people can understand. But another thing that I kind of rolled out, a new talk that I actually did it at Grant's place earlier this spring, was talking about the concept of biological grace. Grace is, we're given grace by God. It's stuff we don't earn. We don't deserve it. We can't earn it. You can't buy it. And that's largely what we see as we try to grow things. We've got free sunlight. We don't buy it. You can't earn it. You don't deserve it, but everybody has it. You got sunlight. You've got the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to grow these plants. You've got free nitrogen in the air. There's 30,000 tons of nitrogen above every acre of soil. You've got all of the minerals that your soil is made up of. You've got all the biology that's there to make it all work. and then you get water, you get free rain. And so it's not always as consistent as we'd like to be, but we waste a lot of rain anyway. And so I've got, kind of a talk that lays all those out of how we've got all of these things that God has given us. We've got the things, all of these things that are out there free for the taking. We just need to develop the system that utilizes all of those to make it all work. So yeah, maybe I can come back on another time and we can talk about that.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated because you kind of hinted at it in the Carbonomics, but I don't know, when did you do that talk? When was that?
The one I just described?
Yeah, that video that I watched, that hour-long Carbonomics.
Oh, yeah, I probably have been doing that talk for 6 years, maybe.
Okay, so I'm very fascinated because about the carbon aspect and the carbon credits and the trading of that. That's something I'd love to know, what you're hearing and what you're seeing on your end. That's something I'd love to jump into on another discussion, because that's something that is very relevant right now. And I've got a friend of mine who's a huge farmer here, and I know that's a discussion he's very engaged in, with the region, talking with farmers and trying to figure out how to commoditize that. So yeah, I'd love to get you back on here. This has been a fantastic conversation. Do you have anything in closing, Dallas?
It's obviously really appreciate you coming on and taking an hour out of your day for us here. That's as as I said before, this is something that's it's totally fascinating to us. It's kind of a new world that's been open to us. So we really enjoy talking about it and really appreciate having your time today, Keith. Thank you.
Okay, thanks guys. My pleasure. Take care, everybody. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Keep feeding them. See ya.
Bye.
Bye. That was great.